And I'm back. So now we're going to talk a little bit about strategic technology planning. And I'm just going to do a broad brush overview of technology planning. There are obviously a lot more steps than what we're going to cover here, but just to move us forward at this point, the first thing I think that you have to do is obviously capture where you are before you can move any effort forward or identify any goals that you need to accomplish. Having a really good, concise, clear idea of where you are is a great place to start. You can do surveys. I think I have some that I would be willing to share. I think there are a lot of technology assessment surveys available. N10, TechSoup, you can Google that kind of stuff. I think that's a pretty easy way to get some really good information, basic information. I think also doing interviews is really helpful, and perhaps even a combination of these two efforts, surveys and interviews, to really not only get the quantitative stuff, but obviously capture some qualitative information about the infrastructure and capacities that you have is also important. I think one of the things I'd like to talk about specifically is what I call points of pain. And I think everyone has a term, some more profane than others, for those places in your organization where technology and staff don't get along, they don't line up. The technology either doesn't work the way it's supposed to or the way the staff envisions it, or there is some sort of obstacle that makes the work more difficult rather than easier. So I think it's really good to identify those, because often points of pain in an organization create a whole cascade of inefficiencies throughout the organization simply from the existence of a single bottleneck or obstacle. And I also think that when we get to sort of the tiered approach to identifying things that you'd like to fix, points of pain can be a great place to start. Those surface really quickly. Often staff don't talk about them, and so that's where I think kind of the survey interview combination can be extraordinarily helpful, because it will surface not only kind of, like I said, the quantitative stuff, but also the qualitative stuff, the places where staff is really irritated and annoyed, and we might be able to address that through this goal selection process. So if we move on to the next step, using a tier system to move multiple items in parallel. I want to refer back to something that I think both Jane and Jeff referenced in their portion of the presentation, which talks about the need for cross-departmental committees, and how important it is that every job type, every level of management, every kind of employee in an organization have an opportunity to participate in identifying some of the technology goals that the organization needs to implement, because everyone looks at technology, uses it in a different way, has a different perspective, and really the voice of the user needs to be come from a variety of sources, and not simply be one person's or one job types, only attorneys or only management. Everybody in the organization needs an opportunity to be at that table, I think, because often there are those different perspectives that really lead to strategic goal setting and change within the organization in a positive way. The other way I think of the tier system is to think about it in terms of moving goals in parallel, that you don't have to do everything in a very sequential way, in that we're going to do this thing first and then that thing and then another thing. We're going to have goal 1, 2, 3. We're really going to look at these 3 levels of the kinds of goals we can select, and we're going to select a couple of goals from each one of these different buckets. The first level is sort of the cheap and easy fix. Often your IT staff has ideas about ways in which the current infrastructure can be easily streamlined or made more effective. I think of those as kind of your tier 1 low-hanging fruit. You have kind of a mid-range or short-term things that we want to improve, but take a little bit more time, a little more thought, a little more money, a little more effort to identify and then subsequently implement. And that really does require the buy-in of kind of your mid-management, and perhaps more of the frontline staff to participate in, because they're gonna have a bigger, broader, perhaps impact on the organization. And then, of course, we have long-term big goals, and that's your traditional strategic planning, which really does require the input, sponsorship, and political will of the organization behind it in order to be successful. And that's really your executive team, and perhaps for your organization, your board as well. And so picking little bits and pieces from each one of those kind of broad buckets sometimes allows you to move the organization further in maybe a shorter amount of time, because you're having a series of unanticipated benefits or unexpected benefits that may arise from multiple change efforts happening at the same time. And I also think that people get change is a skill like anything else, and that as people get practice with it and gain some comfort level with the fact that it's an evolving process, there's always some way to improve, that cultural benefit can be an outcome from multi-tiered efforts, and that it reduces some of the anxiety, at least for some staff. There's always going to be some staff for whom change is always a bad word. But anyway, that's this slide and sort of my thinking around strategic planning. So now we get to do the really stuff that I find very exciting, and that is I'm going to give you a couple of models, and then I'm going to walk you through what I think about those models and how we might use them. And in my own thinking about personal change and just change management for organizations, there's kind of two ways to do it. You have incremental change, and then you have radical change. And incremental change means I'm going to make a tweak to my day, and that over time that will have a cumulative impact, obviously to the bar chart where, it's like you start out really low, but then the cumulative effect over time is great. And then there's radical change where we blow everything up and we start over. And I've done both of these kinds of things in my life, and I'm a fan of both of these kinds of things because I think they each have their place and their value. So thinking about it from those two perspectives, I'm going to talk about the aggregation of marginal gains. And that is the more formal way to talk about incremental change. And the example that I'm going to use is the British cycling team of 2012. It was called Team Sky. And the general manager for the British cycling team was Dave Brailsford. And the winner of the Tour de France that year was Bradley Wiggins. And that is the first time in the then 109-year history of the Tour de France that a British cyclist had ever won. It was the first time ever that the British team had won, and that was in 2012. And he's now Sir Bradley Wiggins, which is what happens to you in England when you win the Tour de France for the first time in its 109-year history. And the interesting thing that Dave did when he took over Team Sky, the British cycling team, in 2009, was he said, he looked at their performance, and I'm sure, as you can imagine, in any sports, there is a ton of performance data, a ton of information about different cyclists, about the team. But as he put the team together, he realized that there was no one big thing that they needed to do. What they really needed to do was all of their performance measures needed to improve. And so he implemented a system of implementing 1% changes, 1% improvements across the board. And they did a lot of really typical things you would expect. They made 1% improvements in nutrition. They optimized the ergonomics of bikes by 1%. They optimized the tires that they use, the air pressure in the tires. They optimized training methods, everything by 1%. And they did some kind of unusual things. They looked at the pillows that the cyclists used, and they found the ones that gave them the best rest. And it resulted in a 1% improvement in their sleep benefit. They did the best way to wash cyclists to wash their hands to reduce sick time by at least 1%. So there was this whole range of improvements that they made to the system, to their performance, by doing these incremental or very small incremental micro changes, but they did them everywhere. They did them across the board, and they thought that they would win the Tour de France in 5 years. from the aggregation of all of these marginal gains, that it was going to result in a win for them, and they did it in 3. So I think there's a really profound effect, cumulative effect to small incremental changes if they're implemented broadly enough and across enough different aspects of your life or work or team. So that's one model. So just hold that in your head over here. That would be the left side. The right side is Built to Last by Jim Collins and Jerry Porras. And they wrote in 1995 a book that really talked about the need to establish, identify, and create big, hairy, audacious goals. So BHAGs, which I think he comes from the military, because that sounds like a military term to me. But the big, hairy, audacious goal was a goal that could not be accomplished in a time period shorter than at least 10 years, typically a little longer, 10, 12, 15 years. And that the idea was that the goal was so big and audacious that the organization in its current incarnation was insufficient to achieve the goal, and that the purpose was to create a great organization that would be capable of achieving the goal, and that was how that's how you accomplished it. That you looked at your current capacity and you realized you couldn't do it with what you currently had. So how do we actually? What are the ways in which we need to change the organization to make it a great organization so that it's possible for it to achieve this big, hairy, audacious goal? And his example that he used, he has several, but the one that really resonated for me is NASA. When NASA was asked to put a man on the moon, NASA realized that the organization they currently had simply did not have the capacity to put a man on the moon, or they would have already done it. And that in order to do that, they had to actually create new technologies, new science, new ways of research, new ways of putting things together, of building things. They had to, I mean, on multiple fronts, they were faced with having to learn a whole lot of stuff about how to build rockets, and how to build rockets that could come back to Earth and that would get there far enough, but be able to carry a human payload. And it was a huge undertaking, and that to me is a really great example of a big, hairy, audacious goal. So now we have that over here, right? And we've got this long-term 10-year thing, and we've got this little incremental thing. And the fascinating thing to me, shows you, a little bit about Joyce here. The fascinating thing to me is how we can take both of those models and make them work together. And for me, it is what I call option C. And I actually stole that term from a friend of mine. Every time we'd get together to go, there's a group of us that would get together to go do something, we would say, do you want to go bowling, or do you want to go to a movie, or do you want to go for a hike, or do you want to go for a bike ride? And he always came back with option C. Option C is to do both things. He says that we create all these yes and no, either or kind of false dichotomies all the time in our lives, and that may simplify things, but it also limits you and creates these unnecessarily constrained parameters, and that we should always try to do both, or at least identify what we're trying to accomplish with the two activities, and then see if we can at least accomplish the goals, even if the activities have to be modified. So I think we should do both of these things. By taking the option C approach, why can't we perhaps assume that by implementing 1% changes across the board and doing it in an iterative way in which we every year look for either new ways to improve things by 1% or new things that need to be improved by 1%, and that in the process of doing that, the cumulative benefit will be to create an organization that has the capacity that is necessary to accomplish the big, hairy, audacious goal. And that we should look at these things as not being two opposing forces, but rather complementary models that might help us really look at large-scale systemic change in a way that we can envision, because I think big, hairy, audacious goals are intimidating and they're scary, and incremental gains are not, marginal gains are not. So how do we use that less threatening strategy to support perhaps a much more large scale kind of strategy? And I just get very excited because big, hairy, audacious goals have power, and they call on they're inspiring, they call on your soul, they are have a certain amount of passion or require a certain amount of passion. And I think when you're looking at large scale systemic change, which we are perhaps at a point in the justice system where that is what we're doing. But in order to accomplish that, we need to find ways to bring people into this thinking or this community that is not a threatening or challenging, but that looks incremental and simple, but perhaps has an undiscovered power also in it. And see, these are the kinds of things you can say when you record and send it out ahead of time rather than having to be in the room. But I think I'm going to be on the phone, so you'll have Joyce in stereo, so I can answer your questions about this and any of the stuff that I've presented today. It's been a pleasure, and thank you very much.